I'm going to go ahead and start as people trickle back in. Thank you so much. Just a couple of announcements. We will be having lunch after. We'll first hear from Dr. Annie Fukushima about her upcoming book, and then we'll have our panel moderated by myself and Professor Kim, and then we will have a lunch, which if you registered for, we're so excited for everybody to come. We're hoping to continue this dialogue, and we'll have each of our panelists and professors and other experts located at the tables for you to interact with, and we're excited about that aspect. And then just if you didn't register for lunch but you're thinking of staying, please come and talk to us. And lastly, a plug for our workshop begins at 1:30, and this is going to be a workshop on T&U visas, which is for everybody. It's not just targeted toward attorneys, it's how to recognize those who might benefit from a T&U visas, which are immigrant visas, which would allow trafficking victims and abuse victims to get legal status in the United States. So we're so excited about that workshop. So if you're, maybe you have to go, but please come back if that interests you at all. So I will introduce Dr. Fukushima. So Dr. Fukushima is a professor here at the University of Utah, and her research focuses on migration, violence, sexual slavery, and human trafficking. She is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research bridges sociological analysis with visual studies, cutting across fields of sociology, American studies, gender studies, ethnic studies, and legal studies. And her book, Dr. Fukushima has been a part of this event over the past 5 years, and she's really helped guide some of our programming today. And as she was talking to us, she was telling us about her book. And her book answers some of these questions that we're asking today. Who are the victims of trafficking? How does migration and immigration intersect with trafficking? And that's exactly the kinds of things that her book addresses. And so I said, you have got to come and talk about your book. It's not out yet. Otherwise, we'd have, copies for sale. But we're so excited to hear about her book. And without any further ado, we'll have Dr. Fukushima.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and for Kathleen Kim for your amazing remarks, as well to the panelists that will help flesh out this larger story. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, and I did want to say that there are flyers out front on the SJSI table where you can actually pre-order the book at a discount. And so I'll just read an excerpt. In 2017, I was called upon by a local organization in California to examine cases of youth who had been trafficked into the United States. The goal was to examine the cases for human trafficking and provide expert reports to supplement their cases for U.S. citizenship and immigration services and asylum officers. Some of the youth cases went as far back as 2014 and involved children from south of the U.S. border, migrating across the U.S.-Mexican border from countries like Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala, being treated as criminals and therefore deportable. Debates surrounding expedited removals circulated in spite of story upon story of persecution, violence, and human trafficking. The youth cases spoke to dominant ideologies and misplaced anxiety surrounding the stereotypes of the, quote, hordes, end quote, of migrants entering the United States, in spite of the trends showing that migration from countries like Mexico was at a net zero. As migrant children and their families attempted to enter the United States through the border, policymakers were quick to criminalize the migrants, alleging visa fraud for the trafficking visa. Anti-traffickers and policymakers debated the misperceptions of the visibility of migrant children, exposing the gaps in U.S. immigration policy and practice. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees found that based on 400 interviews, 48% of the children crossing the U.S.-Mexican border experienced violence or threats by organized crime groups, and 22% experienced violence in the home or by caretakers. In spite of the perception of illegal migration, victim witnesses, survivors of border violence from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, told a more complex story. While headlines focused on migrant children who were released to traffickers, Others, like Saul from Honduras, illuminated experiences of being trafficked as they made their way to the United States. Saul's story is found in a statement released by the Freedom Network USA in August 2014, a response to the discourse surrounding undocumented children. Saul's story is as follows. Saul grew up in a gang-infested neighborhood in Honduras. For several years, the local gang tried to forcibly recruit Saul. They beat him, threw battery acid on him, and threatened to kill him. One day, when Saul was walking with a female friend, the gang attacked them. Gang members beat Saul and raped his friend. Saul knew that if he did not join the gang, they would kill him. Saul begged his mother, who was in the United States, to send him, since there was nowhere safe for him in Honduras. When Saul was 15 years old, Saul's mother finally was able to arrange for a man to bring him to the United States. However, before reaching the border, he was captured and trafficked in Mexico by armed men. His traffickers took him to a hotel room where he was kept for a couple of weeks. Saul's traffickers then forced him to carry a backpack with drugs across the border. Threatened with his life, Saul had no choice but to smuggle the backpack across the border for his traffickers. He finally was able to escape his traffickers when he was apprehended by CPB in Texas. Terrified, he reported what happened to him. And eventually he was able to get a T visa. So stories like Saul's provide the everyday person with a sense of intimacy and insight into trafficking experiences, where migrants are considered to have been trafficked by anti-traffickers, So they receive immigration relief in the form of a T visa. As Saul is identified as someone who is in need of immigration relief, he is also a reminder of those whose entry is denied due to the larger national discourse surrounding legality and migration. In an effort to name migrant crossings through frames of victimhood and vulnerability, anti-trafficking practitioners reinforce heteronormative notions of exploitation by which boys are portrayed as labor exploited and girls as sexually exploited. While sexual violence at the border is a reality, Saul's labor story reinforces paternalistic ideologies and practices defining the anti-trafficking movement. Stories of danger and protection are central to human rights appeals. Saul, a victim from the global south, contrasts with his rescuers from the United States, the global north. Organizations utilize these human rights modes at congressional hearings, in the news, on their websites, in lobbying efforts, through fundraisers, and in the everyday, as a means to create a picture that this is human trafficking or this is abuse. While Saul offers a complex example of what it means to cross into visibility as a trafficking subject, his story, like the multiple case studies that appear in Migrant Crossings, offers lessons on the power to include and exclude through notions of legality, victimhood, and citizenship. So in Migrant Crossings, I answer multiple questions. How do migrants like Saul cross into visibilities in ways that enable their inclusion? Is this inclusion dependent on being seen as a victim? Who is seen as illegal, criminal, and even deportable? What is the consequence of witnessing transnational migration through normative views? More specifically, how does a migrant cross into visibility as a trafficking subject? What are the subjectivities migrants are bound to that shape their visibility as trafficked person? What sort of witnessing is required for the witness to be seen beyond the dualities that construct their subjectivities? In Migrant Crossings, I'm committed to unveiling the contradictions shaping the lives of migrants who experience violence. Take, for example, Rigoberto Valle. In 2009, Valle's case exposed contradictions in California law. Valle's trafficking allegations did not lead to his being witnessed as a sympathetic victim in the legal system, in spite of his testimonial that coyotes who brought him to San Francisco had demanded $500 for his passage from Phoenix and ordered him, at the point of gun and then knife, to earn it by dealing crack. The sum was on top of $1,500 his family had paid the smugglers to get across the border. Valle's defense attorney argued that he was a victim. After being smuggled into the United States, he had options to sell drugs or be killed. Before selling drugs in San Francisco, Valle had been locked up for 3 days, at which point he was, quote, quite literally in fear of his life, end quote. However, in spite of the allegations of victimhood, the prosecution argued in his closing statement, quote, he may or may not have been trafficked. That's not the issue. The issue is, did he commit a crime? End quote. Unlike Saul, Valle's victimhood could not supersede his criminality. Cases like Valle's and Saul's are part of the repertoire of the stories that circulate about human trafficking, whereby some cases are seen as human trafficking and others relegated to the status of quasi-human trafficking or invisible forms of human trafficking. The consequence for migrants like Valle is incarceration and deportation. So I implore the reader to enact what I call an unsettled witnessing. An unsettled witnessing is a commitment to witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing. Unlike spectators, witnesses are called to actions. The necessary actions to unsettle witnessing include raising questions about normative aspects of events and examining the politics of representation around victimhood and criminality, citizenship and legality as infused with the discourse of nationhood, race, and gender. Such witnessing enables a witness to see a migrant for their complex personhood, beyond the narratives that construct them as other, as victim, criminal, and as a subject to be pitied. As anti-traffickers are called to witness human trafficking, Migrant Crossings appeals the reader to consider the categorical definitions of trafficking as tethered to dualities of victimhood, legality, and citizenship. That is, I ask the reader to see Saul's and Valle's stories for their complexity, to raise questions about the normative aspects in their stories surrounding abuse, gender, race, national origins, and sexuality, and to reconcile the tension that this book embarks on is in the midst of that I too am a participant in processes that further the politics of representation about human trafficking. And so I'm not going to go into the book, but the details of chapter by chapter, but I just wanted to thank the organizers for an opportunity to just share just a little bit of an excerpt. I go into cases of Asian and Latinos that are trafficked in the United States, into informal economies, from domestic work, sexual economies, even informal of committing a scam. And it's a book that has been a process, and it's available for pre-order. And I'm here as a professor at the University of Utah, so I also welcome a dialogue to have conversations with folks, and I look forward to hearing about the wonderful work that folks are doing here, and I hope that you will be able to go to the workshop on T visas and U visas. I think learning about these legal processes is very enlightening. It tells us a lot about the process, what migrants go through to be seen as human. And so without further ado, I'm going to thank you for this time, and I think somebody else is going to do something, so thank you.
Hi everybody, my name is Cara, and I'm also on the SJSI board, and I've been in charge of the Human Trafficking Symposium this year. And it's my job to introduce the panel. This year we decided that we wanted the panel to be titled Bringing It Home, Approaches to Trafficking in Our Community. So we really wanted to kind of tie this all back to a local level and see what we could do here. So I'm just going to introduce each member of the panel, a short bio about each of them, and then we'll get started. So first we have Alex McBean. Alex McBean has 13 years of experience fighting for the rights of immigrant workers and has helped over 150 victims of human trafficking obtain visas and later lawful permanent residence. From 2005 to 2016, Alex managed the farm worker program at Utah Legal Services, where he assisted hundreds of farm worker clients to obtain legal status in the U.S. for themselves and their families. Next, we have Shannon Cox. Shannon is one of the founders of Journey of Hope and also the executive director, a peer mentoring program that works for women faced by challenges including, but not limited to, addiction, abuse, trauma, trafficking, and the complexities of the judicial system. Next, we have Carlos Izquierda, currently serves as the U.S. Attorney's Office at the U.S. Attorney's Office as the Human Trafficking Coordinator. In his current position, AUSA Izquierda prosecutes all human trafficking cases, including sex trafficking and labor prosecutions. In addition, he is a member of the Violent Crime Prosecution Team and prosecutes cases involving domestic and international terrorism. Finally, we have Allison Smith. She is the Education and Outreach Specialist for the Trafficking in Persons program at the Refugee and Immigrant Center Asian Association of Utah, where she conducts trainings to educate all organizations, public or private, agencies and communities throughout Utah regarding human trafficking and best practices in supporting survivors of human trafficking. We really appreciate each of you guys being here today, and I'm going to hand it over to Amy. And Kim are going to do the questions for the panel. If you do have any questions, Kim has a microphone, and we'll get started. Oh, and sorry, we also have the app, and you're more than welcome to submit questions on there.
Thanks, Cara. So we are just going to jump right in with each of you. As you know, our theme this year is the vulnerability of movement. In your work that you do on a daily basis, what have you found are the reasons or common themes that those migrating and immigrating to different areas of the world or here to the U.S. makes them more vulnerable to trafficking? And let's just start with Alex and then go down the line.
I would say that our broken immigration system makes people vulnerable to trafficking, and it's not so much that they're immigrating in and of itself, is that they face so many legal and social landmines as they're moving, and this includes work visas that tie workers to a specific employer, and if they leave that employer, they're considered an illegal immigrant and deportable. It includes just people who cross the border illegally into the United States and then enter into industries that have widespread exploitation, and even if nobody ever explicitly tells them that they can be deported if they complain about those exploitative working conditions, they know it. They know that there's consequences, or there could be consequences to speaking up.
I come from 20 years in law enforcement, and so my perspective is that when we criminalize the other, then we don't have to look at the trauma-informed pathways that brought them to that space. If we only see them as drug mules and addicted individuals, then we can keep putting them in spaces that do more harm than good. So we have to have a complete shift away from criminalizing people that started in trauma. But as long as we see all of those little boys in our detention facility in downtown Salt Lake City, Utah, as drug mules and not as trauma victims, we will continue to do what we've always done.
I have a little different perspective as a federal prosecutor, but the vulnerability issue is the same as Professor Kim illustrated. So the view of migrants being criminals always plays a factor. But in regard to labor and sex trafficking, it prevents those people from coming forward. They won't self-report. They won't identify themselves as victims for fear of deportation. And it's not just having to be removed from the United States, it's the process of being removed from the United States. Where small children are placed in cages, where adults are placed in prisons, all waiting for a civil process. Recently, it's even become more difficult to get U visas for our victims. The current administration has delegated that as a non-priority. So when you do uncover a group of victims from Mexico, we're unable to keep them in the country because we cannot process those U visas quick enough to have them maintain their status here until we can process those people and prosecute those people whom are victimizing them.
So I come from a direct service organization, and could I have the team that I'm with stand, please? Erica, Aaron, and Vimelia. They are the caseworkers that are on the front line that do amazing work. Thank you, ladies. And so I'm going to be speaking based upon their experience and our collective experience as an organization. So just to highlight a few things that we see often. Obviously, when someone is new to a country, they are marginalized. They don't have the same language. And so that is a vulnerability. Just that alone, not being able to converse with people in their community or people that they are around. And so that is one vulnerability. Another vulnerability is the isolation that an immigrant or a migrant would experience coming into another country. So if we're just talking about those two things, language and that isolation, those are major vulnerabilities for someone to be taken advantage of in ways that we can only imagine, that we've experienced through those that we serve. So I would just highlight those just two vulnerabilities that we see on the ground in terms of serving those victims that we do, especially in the labor trafficking dynamic.
I just had a couple comments. We're co-moderating, but that trauma-informed policy and practice, I think is so critical, and those of us who work with victim populations can see that that they are particularly vulnerable because, I mean, we've all experienced some level of trauma, but the extremes of it can lead to victimization in the future. And I wondered if the other panelists have sort of a trauma-informed practice in your own work.
Go ahead.
I'd love to comment on that. We absolutely do. So for the two vulnerabilities I just spoke to, and there are many, many more that we could cover, we provide interpreting for those that we serve. We also establish ways to enable that individual to have a meaningful connection to their community, whatever that is. It is so important that we meet victims and survivors of trafficking where they are. It is vital. We come to them on their terms. We speak in their language with the terms that they use. It is so vital that they feel that we are 100% there for them and meet them on their terms. So in terms of the language addressing that, we do the interpreting. We have, I think, 45 different languages that our agency provides interpreting, and that's one-on-one interpreting, not on a telephone. And then in terms of establishing meaningful connection to the community, there are a myriad of ways. We have 45 different agencies we have MOUs with at this point that serve our victims or survivors.
Unfortunately, in the federal system, that hasn't been a focus. That's one of the points of issue that we've had continuing, and there's a lack of training, especially with local law enforcement, on empathy. So we're trying to move in that direction. We have a very good UTIP program focused on services and identifying individuals in these circumstances as victims and treating them as such and communicating with them in that way. But we're falling far short.
Journey of Hope was created to be gender responsive and trauma informed specifically. And so in everything we do, we look at the way, the spaces in which we bring clients into and whether they feel safe in those spaces emotionally and physically. We know when we go to them in jails and prisons, they may not feel emotionally and physically safe, and we actively talk to them about that. There are policies and practices that are evidence-based around being gender responsive and trauma informed that are very intentional, including teaching my staff to use motivational interviewing, relational communication techniques, to be responsive to culture, To be client-centered in the victim world, that's victim-centered approach. So the victim or the client drives the plan instead of us taking their power away and telling them what they need. And then we have to cross-train all of our partners, because not all of the hundreds of amazing partners that we all utilize in this community understand what it looks like and feels like, that empathy piece, to walk into spaces where people are judging you by the tattoos on your body and the aroma of smoke on your clothing, or the differences perceived if you have a different color of skin. We also have to do a lot of training around our white privilege, those of us that come in as allies. To be very intentional in those spaces, we have to acknowledge the privilege that we come with in this work. And for me, as a prior law enforcement officer, that's an additional layer of privilege that I have to acknowledge. I need to open the door for these women to find their voice and speak their truth, and not take their voice or power away from them. And that takes very, very intentional interactions. So we do more training than they probably care for. My staff are right there in that front row. And a lot of them are survivors and peer leaders, and even trafficking survivors. So there is power in the peer work. They truly get it, maybe too much empathy. So helping them then regulate, because if you're doing trauma-informed work, you're experiencing vicarious trauma. You're hearing the stories. And if you have a trauma history, which most of us in this work do, we feel it a little bit too close to the heart. So then how do you stay emotionally centered to do trauma-informed work? And that is very intentional. So then my job as an administrator is to teach them to do the work and then keep them in a healing space so that they can continue to do the work, because it is harmful to do the work. It is harmful to the practitioners that are doing it. So being trauma-informed is larger than a training. It's multiple levels of training and delivery and monitoring and coaching. And then once they're doing that trauma-informed work, then you have to help keep your staff healthy. And that's a whole nother level of trauma-informed work.
I kind of like to speak about this from a legal perspective. I have been learning a lot about trauma, and have been, I think, making a lot of mistakes concerning trauma, trying to address a particular legal issue with regards to T visas, which is to help a person get a T visa, you have to show that they are physically present in the United States on account of trafficking. And part of that is often showing that they need to heal and recover from being a victim of human trafficking. But sometimes we impose culturally insensitive means of healing from human trafficking. We say, okay, you are a victim of human trafficking, and we need to show that. We need to prove it. So you got to go to therapy. And this is reinforced by the Vermont Service Center, who adjudicates these applications. Sometimes they want specific information. They want case notes that show that when the person was going to therapy, they are talking about human trafficking. And if they're talking about anything else besides human trafficking, well, then you're out the door. You haven't proved it. And so that is a big challenge. But I've been discovering there's innovative ways to address that challenge. For instance, I work with the Filipino Worker Center in Los Angeles, and they have kind of workshops. They call them workshops. They call them self-sufficiency workshops. But what kind of happens is that a lot of Filipinos who have been victims of human trafficking, they get together and they share their stories with one another, and they've been isolated for many years, and then they discover while they're sharing their stories to one another, that they're not alone, and that has a healing effect for them. And then another thing that Filipino Worker Center does is they ask people to volunteer to come to events and share their talents. And so there's many ways of healing. And I think that what I'm learning is not to give in to you got to go to therapy, you got to get this specific information, to just say, hey, the nonprofit organizations that help victims of human trafficking have all the expertise within those organizations that is needed to help that person heal in a culturally sensitive way, and there's many different ways. And another thing that I'm being taught is that for T visa, you don't have to prove harm. You don't have to prove that the person was harmed. You have to prove physical presence on the account of human trafficking, which sometimes means proving that, they need to be here to heal from that. But I think one of the things that I'm learning is that it should be assumed that they need to heal from that, and that if they're in a organization that has the expertise to help victims of human trafficking heal, then they meet that requirement.
So I'm gonna start taking questions. We have a lot of questions coming in from the Slido. And maybe you all can talk a little more about your work. Obviously, that's what we're interested in. But what are some ways for our audience members to identify a trafficking situation? And if you suspect a trafficking situation, what steps should you take? Who should you call, and what should you say to that person that you're talking to? We'd love to hear your perspectives on that. Just jump in. Sure.
Okay. Let's see. So we're talking about red flags, things to look for. And then what was the other part of the question? Pardon me.
Once you see those red flags, then what?
Okay. So there are a variety of dynamics involved, right? So in terms of potential red flags, we're talking about someone who is forced to work long periods of time. I'm just going to give you just off the top of my head things related to labor trafficking. Someone who's forced to work long periods of time and they are not compensated for that. Someone who does not have possession of their travel documents. So, for example, they come into the country. They may come in the country completely legally, right? And I love the term lawfully present. That was beautiful. Dr. Kim used today, and I will be using that from now on. They come in and they're here lawfully. They also may be unlawfully present. But in the case I'm going to give you, say they come in lawfully present, they have their documents, the trafficker, although at that point they don't know they're being trafficked, that they say, here, let me keep your documents. I'll keep them safe for you. We'll make sure your work visa is renewed and all of that. And they come into the country, for example, in Utah, it would be sheep herding, would be an example of that. Another, I can give you so many examples. But anyway, and so they come in legally, they're all good to go. The mistreatment begins and they begin to complain. And then, of course, ICE is threatened and, all of these things, even though they might even be here legally, still because of the climate, the fear is present, right? So they simply, go along, and then finally it gets to the point where they've had it, and so they really begin to complain. And then that's when the trafficker says, well, that work visa that we supposedly renewed for you, we did not. Therefore, you are here unlawfully, and now there's even additional leverage. So that's an example of that dynamic. And then let's see, other red flags. Wow. Okay, so someone who is not able to move from place to place. They might live and work in the same place. And I should leave other red flags for others in the group. And then what was the second half of the question? Sorry, I'm now going back to that. Second half.
What steps should you take?
Okay, so there are 3 options in the state of Utah. Actually, there are more than 3. If you think something is an emergency situation, call 911. If you think it is not an emergency situation, we have an Attorney General's tip line that you can call, and there is the Secure Strike Force. Their main job is to investigate and prosecute human trafficking in the state. And I can give you that number off the top of my head. I don't have it, but I think I brought it with me. It starts with a 200. Here it is, 801-200-3443. That is the AG tip line, okay? And then, of course, there is the 800 number, the Utah the Trafficking in Persons Hotline, which is 888-3737-888. In terms of locally here, what can you do if you want to volunteer? There are a myriad of organizations, including ours, OUR, many others that do a lot here on the ground. Shannon's organization, many that could use volunteers that care, that are willing to help with whatever's needed. And so the other last thing is I have someone that came to me probably about a month ago at a presentation I was doing at UVU, and she said, you know, I was in Walmart and I saw the situation between this guy and an older kind of gentleman, actually, I won't say gentleman, anyway, this guy and this younger girl. And she said, you know, I didn't know what to do. I knew something was wrong. It looked like an element of control. Oh, that's another big one. Element of control, where you see someone that clearly has, and you can feel that vibe. That's all I can say, you know, that element of control. For example, I might ask you a question when you come into the doctor, but you might answer for her. That's an element of control. So anyway, the dynamic, this lady said, you know, she wasn't sure what to do. And the bottom line is you just do the best that you can. My only thought was, you know, it's possible to just kind of stay near, but of course don't endanger yourself in any way. And then if they go out to a car and they get in, simply call in that license plate to law enforcement. So that's just one little thought, and actually several little thoughts. Okay.
Anytime you see others limit the movement of an individual or groups of individual, that's going to be a tip-off. What I regularly see in my office is Asian nationals, particularly women, who are brought into our local subdivisions. They are housed in your neighborhoods, and you'll notice that there's probably the owner of the house or someone who is in control of the house, who will take the women every morning. They'll leave, they'll go to a location like a massage parlor, or a nail salon, or a field, or the shepherds, and then they'll bring them back to that location. So if you notice that kind of strange movement where those individuals aren't really ever on their own, that's probably a good indicator. UTIP, 911, your local law enforcement. If you're not getting any response there, call the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ask for me. I'll get an agent involved, and we'll check out whether your suspicions are founded. If they're not, great. But if there are, then we can take action.
I would say for those of you who work with vulnerable populations, I think a lot of you are working with vulnerable populations that are here at this conference, to start asking the question through a trauma-informed lens about how they got to that space, especially if they're in your detention facilities, juvenile justice, DCFS, hospitals, what the story looks like. Because oftentimes we don't ask the right questions. What happened to you? Instead of why are you doing this thing, right? Why did you bring drugs in? Why are you addicted right now? Ask the right questions to really find out how they got there and what's happened to them along the way. It's those questions that allow us to see that trauma-informed pathway, that violence pathway that led them into the spaces where we work.
Almost anyone who comes into the United States on a work visa has a contract. And so that contract is often used as a well, that contract is a two-edged sword, and usually it's being used against them, saying, hey, you're contracted to work for this company, and if you leave this company, then you are in violation of that contract. And but on the other side of things, the employer isn't keeping their side of the contract. They're not paying what they're supposed to. They're maybe, we talked a lot about working too many hours. What about employers that have too many workers and they're not giving them enough hours, and the people often have paid a lot of money in order to come to work in the United States, and they're not able to work off the debt that they incurred to be able to come and work in the United States. So that's a big thing for me, is if there's a contract or if there's a guest worker, then on the one side that if they leave, then they're going to be an illegal immigrant subject to deportation. But on the other side, are the employers complying with their obligations under the contract?
Okay. Do you mind if I ask a follow-up? A lot of my work with trafficking has been at the intersection of immigration, workplace rights, and when one works in that area, we come up against sort of a double-edged sword. If we encounter unscrupulous criminal employers, and yet we don't necessarily have access to talk to the workers, to come up with a safety plan for them, understand what their interests are, do they want to bring this employer to justice or not, then we could be left helpless. And so I'd love to hear from you, Alex, and the rest of the panelists, how to resolve that dilemma. So your intuition is very strong. There's something wrong going on here, but the consequences could be deportation of the worker, or even maybe a lesser harm, just losing their job, but because of a precarious immigration status, they would be unemployable elsewhere.
I guess I'll start this time. So it's very difficult to represent people who are currently being trafficked. I'm actually representing about 6 people right now who are currently being trafficked, and they will, in their situation, they're not going to get out of that trafficking situation until their visa is approved. Partly because of their choice, and partly because of they're in an area that lacks resources to help them. I find a lot of my clients, one thing to think about is I help people who are not necessarily right now victims of human trafficking, but they were at some point in the past victims of human trafficking. And I think those people are an important group of people to help as well. And a lot of times I've talked to people who come right out of human trafficking, and these days I have to tell them, well, you could apply for a T visa, but if it's denied, then you might be put into deportation proceedings, because that's the new Trump administration policy, is that if you're denied any type of immigration application, even a T visa application, then you're subject to or you could be put into deportation proceedings. So I have to tell them all these things, and a lot of times, I got to give them a realistic picture of things on the one hand, but not scare them away on the other hand. And at the end of the day, it's their choice. And so what a lot of people do is they don't want to do that. They want to go with the option of finding a family member in the United States and staying with them a while, and then finding work illegally somewhere else. That's a tried and true method of escaping victimization. And so a lot of people, they're basically trying to stabilize their own situation first, and then later on maybe they start thinking about how they're going to, their long-term plan. And so that's one thing is, well, I guess I'm not really giving a good answer, but you have to balance that, telling them there's resources available and that they're, and you can't ever tell them, oh yeah, you're going to get a T visa, you're going to be approved, because you don't know that, especially nowadays. And so trying to balance those things, here are your options, and maybe sometimes they don't choose to go through the system. They choose to not go through the system. And a lot of times I can't say I blame them.
In my particular situation, we have limited options. As I said before, we've had difficulty pushing through U visas to keep our witnesses in the United States, even if they have family that are lawfully in the United States or here legally on a visa themselves. In a most recent case, Coyote had brought in 8 individuals who had never been to the United States before. There had been no record that they've re-entered illegally, that they've been here illegally before. We attempted to process those people quickly to get them that status so we already had their statements. Look, this is what I went through. This is what I've been through. Utah is my 3rd state that I've been to. These are the conditions I've been living with. I don't have any food. I don't have any money. These are the clothes that I have that are on my back. And we still were unable to get those visas processed quick enough to levy charges against those individuals trafficking them. They were taken quickly to Denver, they were processed, and they were all removed before our office could act. So the broken system is just that. When even the internal government, when other government officers are requesting from other government agencies, this is what we need, it oftentimes falls on deaf ears. The only time that we've had real success is when the victims have been hospitalized and they're suffering from serious injuries, either from a car accident or from abusive treatment. Unfortunately, that's the realities of this broken system.
I am grateful to say that this is really what we address at our agency. We have caseworkers that, so hopefully we get referrals from agencies, and we do have really good dynamics with many agencies in the state. So this is what we do. Our caseworkers get in and work with the victim that has been trafficked, either currently being trafficked or has been trafficked. And we provide services. We, figure out the housing situation, the food. We are grant funded, which allows us to do that. And so we are able to provide a great deal of services for those that we serve, and it can at least help them through the process. The frustrating piece that I've heard from our case managers at times is how frustrating it is that when someone's T visa is being processed, for example, they're not allowed to work. So then how are they going to survive? So gratefully we can sustain that and we can help them, but we can't do it all necessarily. So, that leaves them for alternatives to pursue, which, yeah, it is the way it is. But we do provide a great deal of services, not only someone to partner with and get advice from. Our case managers do a great job in that, but then they can basically do a soft handoff to a lot of other agencies, making sure that those services are provided for them.
Thank you so much. I feel like there are so much expertise on this panel and so many questions that I would like to ask. I wanted to ask you again, Allison, if that's okay, if I could ask you a question about your work with refugees and what portion of the refugee population has also been trafficked?
That's a great question. So the Trafficking in Persons program that I work within, we see only people who have been trafficked. So we only work with victims who have been trafficked. And I do not know the data in terms of that. I know that in terms of the state of Utah, we have a lower percentage of labor trafficking victims than sex trafficking victims. Honestly, I think that's because we're not looking for it. And it's also very, as Dr. Kim pointed out, very hard to investigate. So in terms of answering that, it's difficult to say the percentage of those refugees and immigrants in the state of Utah that are being trafficked, and I think that's your question. And I do not have that data. We are gathering, and I'll just share quickly some data of our labor trafficking victims. We have an age range of 14 to 59. We have 14 females. This is our current caseload just for labor trafficking. We have 14 females. We have 25 males. And one that identifies as other. And we have right now 37 of those that we serve are foreign-born and 3 are domestic. And then in labor, the labor dynamic, we do have one that includes sex and labor, so our total is 40, including the sex and labor would be 41. And then 5 are experiencing issues related to substance abuse and use relative to their exploitation. So that kind of gives you an idea of our current labor trafficking clientele and those that we're serving. But I wish I could answer the other for you, and I'll be looking for that information.
This next question is for Shannon. So Shannon, with the work that you do with victims, what kind of support and services are required for victims to fully rehabilitate?
The first thing we ask clients when they come to us is, are you safe? Because we can't expect for them to begin to address the mental health issues, the addiction issues, until they're safe. And finding safe spaces for them has proved difficult. Even though there are domestic violence shelters across the state, if you're not fleeing an intimate partner that you have cohabitated with by choice, you may be excluded from being able to find safety in those shelters, because we're turning over 1,000 families away on the Wasatch Front that are fleeing intimate partner violence, because we don't have enough room at the inn. So we don't have a lot of safe spaces to put these individuals in the interim. There isn't a lot of funding for motel rooms, for extended stays, while we're trying to find semi-permanent housing for individuals like this, especially those with criminal justice backgrounds. The Scarlet Letter F bars them from living in probably 2/3 of the spaces in this state because of good landlord laws that were enacted and continue to go on in small communities that bar people with any criminal history from living there, even though the state statute is they can't bar them after 7 years with a felony. But people don't know their rights, and they don't feel entitled to their rights, and so they hear the no, and there aren't safe spaces for them. So that's a continuous struggle. Also, there is a lack of affordable housing in this state, and we're thousands of units short non-affordable housing. And so we're pushing the poorer and the most vulnerable out of housing. So at one point, Lloyd Pendleton had worked on the 10-year homelessness plan, and he had housed the chronically homeless to 90-something% in 7 years. Those numbers are now climbing again because we don't have enough spaces to transition people into. And so that is a constant struggle. So until they're safe, how do you expect them to get sober when they're still trying to survive spaces where they're being harmed? Every single woman I've ever worked with that lived in and around the homeless shelters in Salt Lake City have been sexually assaulted. And so you're fleeing and you're still being abused. And I have tried to take girls to the spaces that have been created for homeless youth, and they tell me the traffickers are inside of those spaces. So young men are either homeless or pretending to be homeless, are involved in gangs that are actively trafficking girls to in and out of here in Vegas. I've had girls get drugged in bars and wake up in Las Vegas in a room full of girls from Utah. So there aren't tons of safe spaces to put these people, which is part of the problem, right? Like, even if we have a trafficked girl and we know she's been trafficked, she's going to the detention facility. There has not been an alternative space created for even child victims. Even though we told DCFS 2 years ago, you will do this work, we will divert girls that have been trafficked away from JJS and away from those spaces, we didn't fund safe spaces for them. So they're still going to detention facilities. And there's probably 20 young men sitting in our detention facility right now that are just drug mules. No, they're not. If you ask them their stories, they're abused, they're labor trafficked, they've been raped, and then they ended up in unsafe spaces here and were exploited here. But they're heading back to detention facilities for INS and being taken back to their countries. And so we have to fund. We have to say to our legislators, we care about this issue and we want to fund safe spaces for harmed individuals. Why are we turning 1,000 families away from shelter? Yeah. So we have to have safe spaces for all of those fleeing violence, right, in this community. We shouldn't have to call 10 domestic violence shelters to find one that has a bed in St. George. This is real. And then our woman is like, well, my kids are in school here. Do I pull them out and take them to St. George? And when can I come back? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't answer that for you. Or we have a domestic violence shelter that won't take my women if they don't have access to a vehicle because they're remote, and the women, they complain that they just sit there when they get to that. Well, they've been raped and abused, and it takes a minute to gather yourself. And then you either have to get on the bus at 6 a.m. or there are no more buses until 6 p.m. at night. So they just flat turn down my women that are fleeing lethal violence because they don't have access to a vehicle. So, I mean, barriers. There's all these barriers. But we can solve this issue. We have to act like we care about it, and we have to tell our legislators that we care about it.
This is a question that Amy and I had discussed. So, the trafficking narrative, as we know, has focused a lot on sex trafficking, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. If the primary goal is prosecution, then especially in the context of child sex trafficking, that's an easier crime to prove. But it's also motivated in part by politics, and earlier I gave a couple examples of that. You know, the Clinton administration versus Bush administration versus Obama administration, and I wondered how the panelists respond to that narrative. Does it do good or harm? And I presume if the narrative prevents us, the public and legislators, from looking at the problem holistically, then we might presume that's a harm, and then what needs to be done about that then? And I guess I'll add also, as the co-panelists also raised this issue of and Annie also, the criminal migrant versus perfect victim narrative, and then also male labor trafficking victims versus female sex trafficking victims. And those of us on the field know the reality that those two things often intersect, and labor trafficking victims are often sexually exploited also, and sex trafficking victims are often forced to do menial labor that would be considered legal in a sense.
So that was a really long question,
Sorry.
and I am going to do my best.
I'm sorry about that.
No, and I don't say that in a negative way. I just want to make sure that I answer well. So there are lots of paradigms and dynamics in this field, lots of narratives that probably we would like to change. But one of the things that I would like to focus on relative to the question is this, and that is we have and I did say this before, we have a lower number of labor trafficking victims that we've identified here in the state of Utah than sex trafficking victims. So that is a higher number. And again, I think it's because we're not looking for it. One of the things that we have done, which we are very excited about, is we have begun a partnership with the Mexican consulate and with the other 34 honorary consuls in the state of Utah. We are working with them. Erica has done amazing work. Raise your hand, Erica. She's done amazing work working with the Mexican consul, and we together, she and I, have gone in and done a variety of trainings, not only for those that work there, but also for those that are in the very large 60-person waiting room. And Erica has just done great work in terms of giving a presentation to educate those that are in that space, and again, right, in their language. And we have had many questions, cases, all of those things that have resulted from that. The other thing that we've done is we've pulled in the Attorney General's office, because we are our agency and the Attorney General's office are the co-facilitators of and recipients of the UTIP grant, the Utah Trafficking in Persons Task Force grant. And so we've pulled in the Utah Attorney General's office so that if there are cases that the Mexican consulate has identified as potential human trafficking, they have people that they know face-to-face that they can call about this. This has resulted in many cases that are currently under investigation. One involving an agency, I believe a construction company that here in the state of Utah that basically did not fill out documentation appropriately of 50 of their employees. And what that resulted in is those employees' status being jeopardized, their legal status being jeopardized. And then what they found out, or what they realized, is that they'd filled it out wrong. They actually were dishonest with their employees, didn't tell them what was going on until after the fact. Long story short, it's resulted in a case where 50 people are being able to be helped and assisted. So those collaboratives, I think, are huge to breaking down the barriers, and not really worrying so much about the narrative piece, but more about what are we doing on the ground to make a difference in people's lives. And so that's an example of one of the partnerships that we've been able to facilitate. And we're just getting ready. Someone from the Secure Strike Force and I are going to be doing a joint training at a local law firm here for all of the other 34 honorary consuls. And we're excited about that. We hope that we can really help.
Since 2016, human trafficking has not been a priority for the Department of Justice. Violent crime and terrorism is our directive. Excluding trafficking in children, trafficking in either sex trafficking or labor in children is the easier case. And that we can get approval for, that we have the resources for. The problem comes with adult victims, and it is no longer a priority. We've attempted through UTIP and joining with local prosecutors, law enforcement, to try to change that. But in 2016, I had 2 agents with the FBI working all trafficking cases. Trafficking cases are time intensive. You have to handhold. You have to be empathetic. You have to have particularized training just to speak to our victims. We haven't had in this district since 2014, we've only had 1 labor prosecution, 1. That doesn't mean it's not out there. It's just not a priority, and it's not being investigated. You're correct. Sex trafficking has been an issue in our district. We prosecute more of those crimes, but then we get zero support when we have those types of cases. We don't have the resources. I personally have had to criminalize those victims just to get them resources. So in a typical sex trafficking case, you have one woman who is intimately involved with the pimp. She's known as the bottom bitch. That's not an offensive term. That's just the term that is used in the business. That bottom bitch has been traumatized for numbers of years. They've most likely been introduced to drugs and physical abuse by their pimp. They've gone to hospitals for lengthy stays because of the beatings they get. And it's impossible to develop any kind of trust to assure that person that I can help them. I can get this person out of your life without some expertise and resources. As a result, I've taken to charging that individual to get them a lawyer so we can then get them resources, get them out of jail, get them cooperating, get them into programs to get them started on at least my prosecution path of the real target of that investigation. That's a terrible state. I've had to use that in 2 cases, one last year and one in 2017. Luckily, those women were able to receive resources and completely have changed their lives. But imagine that. You're being charged with a federal felony with a potential sentence of 30 years, minimum mandatory. 30 years. And that's the only way I can get those victims services that they're required. The perspective has to change. We need to prioritize this because it impacts so many people. It is violent. Even though it's labeled as a nonviolent offense, there is violence all the time within this vulnerable group. I haven't had one case that there wasn't one act of violence. There's always the threat, always. But I haven't had one case where a beating hasn't occurred. And I'm not just talking, a slap in the face. I'm talking broken bones, facial reconstruction. The perception of adult women in sex trafficking is that it's a choice, that it's their choice because they're an adult. We aren't empathetic. District court judges have that perception too, where it's required that my victims have to come in and testify at a sentencing hearing again after going through the trauma initially, the trauma through trial, and now the trauma through sentencing. No one wants to go through that. So perspectives really need to change overall.
If I may, and I want to hear the co-panelists, but it's very insightful, and there is a prejudice against adult sex trafficking victims because of that presumption that that there's consent in their commercial sex activity. That kind of dichotomy of perfect victim versus criminal prostitute is similar. It's not the same, but criminal migrant worker subjected to a labor exploitation situation versus, again, the perfect victim. And I just wanted to draw that parallel. But
I'm like a Rage Against the Machine feminist, so I'm not part of the major culture of this community, but from my perspective, as long as we have a commander-in-chief that demonizes people of color, especially immigrants of color, he makes them abusable, whether they're from this country or not. And so for things to change, we have to elect officials that care about all human beings, whether they live in the United States or they're trying to live in the United States.
So trafficking is a broad umbrella, and there's a spectrum involved in trafficking. Almost none of my clients have experienced violence, and many of them have not experienced even the threat of violence. And what the statistics show is that most of the criminal prosecutions of human trafficking are sex trafficking, And then most of the civil cases of human trafficking are labor trafficking.
Oh, interesting.
And so, and there's several reasons for that, but as there is a spectrum in human trafficking, there's also a spectrum of possible remedies available to victims of human trafficking, and perhaps sometimes the remedy that's available to somebody could be as simple as being able to make a complaint with the Department of Labor, be it the Federal Department of Labor or the state agency. And so, and another thing is, when it comes to labor trafficking, there's a lot of exploitation. And there's a lot of industries that exploitation, when I say exploitation, I mean not paying them wages, not paying them full wages, ignoring work injuries, unsafe working conditions. All these things are really widespread, and sometimes it comes down to legal technicalities as to whether it's trafficking or not, because like maybe the person really didn't feel like they could walk away from the situation, or else they'd be reported to immigration, but then nobody actually ever said that, and so it's harder to prove the case. But I think that one way that we can address just human trafficking in general is that we can have better enforcement of just basic labor laws.
So we've talked a little bit about demand, and one of the audience questions was about what can be done to reduce sex buyers here in Utah. And I had a similar question, but when someone mentioned nail salons, what can be done to reduce the demand? Are we as just lay members of the public contributing by some of our irregular activities, or is there anything that could be done by the public to reduce demand for trafficked individuals?
And we're talking labor traffic, right? Or what's the question?
Either one, yeah,
Okay.
Labor or sex. I know it's a big question.
All right. So in trafficking, there is a triangle. There are 3 parts of the triangle. What's the first one? What's the first part of the triangle? Sorry? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, we have those that we've been discussing, right? Which is the victim or survivor. Okay. Then we have someone who's trafficking them, which is called the trafficker. And then we have the third part of the triangle, which is
Demand.
the buyer, the consumer. Okay. And so keep in mind, there are always those 3 parts of the triangle. In terms of that, in terms of how to address the buyer, the state of Utah has not done a lot in terms of addressing the sex trafficking buyer, okay, the buyer of commercial sex. And that is something that we are working very intensely on this year and are working with some legislators on. So we have some plans for that to create a dynamic where it will be very much not in the favor of the buyer to purchase sex. In terms of a labor trafficking dynamic, and so I'll just say, we really haven't done a lot on that, but we have a long ways to go and we're getting after it. But in terms of the labor trafficking dynamic, we work with lots of different agencies that really can target organizations. So for example, a hotel that contracts with, a lot of times in the hospitality industry, we see hotels say, for example, I'm going to throw out Park City. Okay, so Park City, a lot of the hotels contract with someone to come in and do their cleaning. They don't hire people to come in and do the cleaning. So there's a very large agency that contracts with many hotels to come in and do that cleaning. So what we're doing is we're working on the investigative piece to be able to get in and understand the dynamics of that organization that contracts with the hotels to get in and do the labor trafficking and infiltrating that way. We've simply got to address address it. In terms of the public and what can the public do, be aware, ask questions. If you have a new business coming into the community or a new nail salon, be aware, ask questions, ask to talk to the manager or the owner, and ask where they came from. Do they have other businesses? I mean, just a general be super aware. We have one in Ogden that was identified that way. It was a nail salon, and a person in the local neighborhood just came in and started asking questions. She's a member of the Ogden Junior League, and it went from there. So just be super aware. Pay attention to things like, are there sleeping quarters in the back of the nail salon, for example? That might be one, and often is one indicator that there's an issue. There is one thing I want to bring up, which is a little bit sticky, and that is there are lots of stings that are done on massage parlors. And one of the things that they're finding on the Secure Strike Force side at the Attorney General's office, they're finding is very difficult, is that they come in and they do a sting, but then as they have people there to converse with those that are being trafficked, they realize through an interpreter that for them to go back, I mean, basically their family had a choice of who to send in the family to the U.S. to be trafficked. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. They were brought to the U.S. to serve, pay a debt of the family or what have you, and they're here taking care of that. If they are sent back, they are a disgrace to their family. I mean, so this is where cultural sensitivity is huge. They're a disgrace to their family, and then someone else in the family is going to have to go instead. And so there are lots of things to consider in terms of that dynamic. Sorry, long answer. Okay.
For me, it's about opening your eyes to the amount of violence that's occurring in this community, especially towards women and children. There are only 2 violent crimes in Utah that are above the national average, and they have been. The first one has been for as long as I've been in law enforcement and now nonprofit work, 25 years, is we're above the national average in sexual abuse. 1 in 3 females in Utah will be abused. 1 in 6 males in Utah will be sexually abused. We are above the national average. 1/3 of the men in our prison are there for pedophilic acts. 1/3 of the men in our prison are there for pedophilic acts. We don't talk about the amount of abuse that's occurring in this community. It's a shameful topic. Come ski Utah, it's beautiful and it's clean and we hardly have any gang violence, but we rape our children and we kill our wives. The other violent crime in Utah that it's above the national average is domestic violence homicide. 1 in 3 homes here is experiencing domestic violence. There's a lot of violence happening in this community that we don't talk about. And where there's violence and trauma victims that don't get help, they start self-medicating. They end up in very dangerous places, and those women and children are bought and sold in those spaces where drugs are traded. And before they took down Backpage.com, I think Fernando Rivera's class at Westminster had counted 3,000 trafficking victims on Backpage before they took it down, for sale on the Wasatch Front. This is the issue here. Everyone was freaking out that the National Outdoor whatever expo was leaving Utah and going to Colorado. It was the #1 time for trafficking in Utah. We didn't talk about that though. Bye. Go to Colorado. Goodbye. We weren't talking about the amount of violence that was occurring around that moneymaker. So I think we have to be willing to talk about the social issues, because this is an amazing, powerful, beautiful, empathic community. We have more volunteers in our prison from religious institutions than any other prison in the United States, not per capita. That's how many people care about incarcerated populations here. We care about our neighbors. We have to be willing to talk about really ugly, tough subjects in order to change the culture. And then we have to be willing to restore people to health. Because those third of men that are in our prison for pedophilic acts started out as harmed, abused children, and if they had received help when they were trying to survive that abuse, they wouldn't be adult predators. The research behind getting help when you're young versus getting help when you're older is so amazing. Children are pliable. Their brains can heal faster. They heal faster from traumas. They don't keep the inflammation in their brain and bodies and keep having PTSD. Children are resilient, but as adults, we're not. we're not nearly as resilient, and the patterns are set. And so we can change this. This is an amazing, amazing state, and we don't have to keep these as our top 2 violent crimes.
The trafficking cases that I see are entirely driven by supply and demand. Entirely. If there's not a demand for those services, then they're not going to exist. And that encompasses labor too, because the average American doesn't want to go out in a lettuce field in the heat and risk cutting their hand off picking lettuce. That's why you have migrant farmers. As a child who grew up in California, my father took us children to a lettuce farm for the day. It was grueling, despicable work. The housing that I recall wouldn't be housing by any standard. But we need those workers, so we have to have those workers to supply our needs. It's the same for sex trafficking. You're right. We have an abundance of visitors to Utah, companies who hold their annual get-togethers here at the Salt Palace. That has created the attraction of circuit girls. The circuit girls come from all across the United States. Usually they're run by 1 or 2 pimps. And they go across the United States and follow these companies with their products. And it creates a lot of business because there's a lot of demand. We have to address that. In several of our investigations, we question the Johns that are going to these sites, to the massage parlors. And the idea of having street prostitutes it no longer really exists. It's all internet-based. It's all Snapchats, social media. And so it's difficult to follow. So we attack it a different way. We watch and observe. We question the Johns, find out more information, and go that route because of the demand, because there is a demand. So it's an ongoing issue. I don't have any answers for that other than what I'm doing now.
As just a citizen and not a lawyer who helps victims of human trafficking, I feel like my greatest contribution is just to try to be as politically active as I can. And I have to admit, I'm not as politically active as I should be, but I'm on several listservs, and when I see something that comes up and says, hey, call your senator, call your representative, tell them how you feel about this issue, I try to do that, and I've tried on various occasions to meet with my representatives and share the knowledge I have with them. And my paralegal, she's been very active in campaigns and helping people she believes in get elected, and I admire that. And so just that sort of thing I think makes a big difference, just being engaged.
Thank you so much. We have 2 audience questions that we will briefly take. We're going to try to wrap up. So we'll take this one from the gentleman here and then here in the back after that.
So mine's kind of, I'm Matt with Sheepdogs of Salt Lake City. We're a search and rescue anti-human trafficking group located here in Utah. First, I've been coming to these things for the past couple of years, and I kind of hear the exact same narrative over and over of we need to focus, we need to focus, we need to do better. And I'm kind of disappointed because we haven't been doing better. We've just been talking about it and hearing some of the comments today of there's no more street prostitutes out there. I do outreach every Tuesday. There's people in this room that have done that with me, that we see these girls out there. Also at the same time, I'm still confused as to why Utah and all these other organizations, when mine is a nonprofit solely funded by the people in the organization this past year have been able to rescue and save 58 females and 4 males outside of human trafficking, get them services, get their family services, all on our own budget, but you guys don't seem to be able to. What is preventing you from doing that, and how can we as an entire group in here help you guys get the same resources or get the same outreaches that we have in your hands?
So I'll address that. First of all, our organization, as I mentioned, we have over 41 victims of just labor trafficking, and actually that number is about probably 3 times that amount for the sex trafficking victims that we serve. Part of our organization is outreach. We have a drop-in center on Thursday afternoons that many victims come to, and we do a lot of services there. We have 4th Street Clinic, we have harm reduction, we have OUR that has funded a major renovation of that facility, $3,000 renovation, so that it actually looks like a place that people would really want to be at and they feel good in. And so, yeah, we serve a lot of victims, and in fact, I think we've talked a few times, and you called me from the hospital once, and we definitely do a lot for our victims, but you know, there's always more we can do. We've had a 200% increase in victim identification in the last year. We've had a 233% increase sorry, that's the victim identification, the 200% increase in prosecutions of cases, that's with the Secure Strike Force. And then, so we're definitely seeing that human trafficking is on the rise. That increase is related to 2 things. One is education, because people know now much more about what to look for. The other thing is human trafficking has gone from the 3rd largest illicit industry in the United States to the 2nd. So we are seeing a rise. If there is a gang that was involved in drugs before, they're now doing drugs and human trafficking because of the profitability piece. So just from our agency's perspective, that's what we're doing. We have a ton of services. I won't take the time to list them all, but please go to our website or take a card, and we're happy to help any way we can. And I completely applaud your efforts. You do a great job and a great service, so thank you so much for that.
Come to us with your resources. Come to us with your knowledge. That's going to help. The federal government is filled with bureaucracy. Okay? We all know that. We've all experienced that. Tell that to my bank account while I was still working and not getting paid. How ridiculous is that? So yeah, there's a lot of the same going on, but you know, it's been the private sector. It's all of you who have allowed me to do more. So if you have an issue, then you need to contact us, and we can help. Okay, but we're going to also rely upon you to provide those services that the federal government just flat out won't provide. State and local government, they're on limited budgets, so they can't reach out. It's the community that has to help. I'm part of that community, so in my role, I do what I can, and I'm proud of that. But without these people sitting next to me, my victims won't get any services unless I have them arrested. So if I don't know about your program, please inform me. I'm absolutely there to help. If you have people who need help from a criminal perspective, let me know. But you're right, we're repeating ourselves year in and year out, but we're also expanding our resources at the same time.
I think that work should be done by law enforcement. But right now, they're more interested in arresting women for solicitation. I asked one of them to arrest me. He wouldn't get away from the drop-in center on a Thursday, and he was sitting outside in his big black truck, stopping our females as they were walking into the drop-in center. And I said, do you sit over there on Brooklyn Avenue and arrest people walking into detox? It's the same thing. And he threatened to arrest me, and I said, please arrest me. Please arrest me. I dare you. I dare you. And he was getting in the face of all the females. His truck is there every Thursday, blacked out windows. Those
I have
females
approached
are not
that truck
gonna,
as well, just saying.
those females are not going to talk to law enforcement as long as law enforcement is not their friend. So I'll call the AG's office guys in, and they're great because they're there. They've been trained to work with trafficking and traffickers and victims, and they're amazing. But my women are terrified of them because they look just like the white guys that work for Salt Lake City PD. So, I mean, yeah, we need more nonprofit organizations doing this work, but enforcement's supposed to be doing this work. So until they switch their attention from further victimization of the women that are being victimized to the Johns and to the people buying it and see them as victims, you're going to be the only group out there, and OUR is going to be the only group out there doing this work for victims, looking at them as victims, right? And OUR stands for Operation Underground Railroad. We keep saying OUR. Sorry. But, I mean, we need to switch enforcement's view of this work, and they should be doing it. They should, our local law enforcement should be have a just as large a group looking at finding the victims, prosecuting the Johns, the dates, and turn it on its ear. But until that happens, they'll continue to be scared to talk to law enforcement or prosecutors about what's happening because they're criminalized.
Well, I'm the last. I had time to think about this question. So when I worked at Utah Legal Services, we had at one point a group of 60 Thai victims of human trafficking that we were helping. And having all the resources of Utah Legal Services was great because it helped me help more people at one time. And I had pro bono attorneys to help me, and that was great. But on the other hand, working at Utah Legal Services, since it receives federal funds, there's a lot of rules and a lot of people we couldn't help because of those rules. And since I've become a private attorney, I've honestly been able to help more victims of human trafficking because I don't have all those rules weighing me down. And I, as an attorney who specializes in helping victims of human trafficking, feel that, well, I know that most immigration attorneys, much less attorneys in general, don't know how to identify victims of human trafficking. And so that's kind of something that I try to do, is educate other immigration attorneys about human trafficking and to mentor attorneys when they do T visa cases. And and it doesn't really matter to me whether I'm helping an attorney who's getting paid for his services or whether he's doing it pro bono. I think just the general information about how to represent victims of human trafficking needs to be more widely disseminated.
This panel is so insightful, and I think that the values that were expressed are shared. At least with me, based on what all the panelists said, I have the responsibility of sort of tying this up and tying together some of the themes and ending the panel. I think it was Alex that mentioned political will is important in adding to prevention efforts in the future, and it's our we have a civic duty, civic responsibility to participate in the direction of where our politics should go. We're taxpayers, and our funding goes there. So I want to bring it all the way back to my comments earlier about the 13th Amendment. The reason why the Trafficking Victims Protection Act exists is because of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution that abolished chattel slavery. Congress enacted additional provisions to now criminalize sex trafficking and forced labor. So this is a constitutional mandate, or derived from the Constitution. So we should be providing resources to the non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations doing this work, and it is up to us to pressure the government or participate in social justice movement to urge our government in a certain direction. So I just wanted to note a couple examples. Federal funding was taken away from so-called sanctuary cities and states, and this money generally goes to federal law enforcement. When we live in a capitalist democracy, we have to balance capitalism with democracy. And labor exploitation, sexual exploitation shouldn't exist in our country. That should be an aberration of supply and demand and market dynamics. The only thing that's going to balance that out is how we define democracy and principles of democracy and hold our political branches accountable for upholding those principles. Because there are so many structural imbalances and so many structural inequities in power, and so non-citizens are increasingly deprived of due process rights. This is something that we can see immediately on the ground, but it comes from a foundation of structural inequity. And women and their constrained choice set, women who are further marginalized by race and poverty, they live in conditions similar to vulnerable migrants from Central America that are seeking just survival in the United States. They're coming from a background of such horrible background conditions that they have little choice. Often they choose exploitation. We have to pay attention to that also, and I think that that's a shared theme that I heard across the panel. We need to focus on empowering our neighbors who are less privileged than ourselves to have a wider range of choice.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a thank you.
Okay, so we just wanted to tell you a little bit about what's happening next. We have a lunch, and you guys should have some pink tickets if you're going to attend the lunch, but we wanted to tell you a little bit about who is catering. It's called Spice Kitchen Incubator, and it's a project of the International Rescue Committee and was founded in a partnership with Salt Lake County. It's a business incubator that brings together refugees and other disadvantaged community members interested in starting full or part-time food businesses. Spice Kitchen Incubator ensures participants receive technical assistance, training, have affordable access to commercial kitchen space, and learn the steps to establishing a successful food business. So we just thought that they tied in really well to kind of the initiative and what we're trying to do with the symposium.
So yes, thanks, Cara. We're so excited to have Spice Kitchen Catering. And for those of you who are leaving, I just wanted to give a few words on what we've discussed this morning. You know, we try to get feedback every year about this symposium, and for those of you who've come multiple years, we're so glad. But one piece of feedback we get is it's similar every year, so why should I keep coming back every year? And to speak to this comment we had from the audience earlier, the purpose of this symposium is to provide a safe space for these experts and for all of you who do this important work, for somewhere for you to discuss problems and solutions. And we want to continue to provide that space. And so sometimes it seems like, what are the solutions? Are we talking about solutions? Are we feeling like we're going to go and do something? But at the end of the day, the point of this symposium is to really think critically about where we're at and, take the next year to do those things that will make it better. And as students, we only get 1 year to run this event. And so your feedback is so important. So if you registered for this conference, you will receive an email that will have a survey about what you thought about the symposium. So we would encourage you to fill that out, give constructive feedback. We are always trying to make it better, but again, we get 1 year. Next year it'll be the first year law students currently who will run this event. So we'd love any feedback that you have. And again, thank you so much for coming, and hopefully you'll stay for the workshop. Thank you.